Hello everyone, my name is Malcolm. I am a student at Arizona State University, and I am going to be going over my comprehensive suicide prevention program for veterans, and this is an argument for increasing resiliency programs. We'll be discussing a lot of different subjects as part of this, everything from healthy eating to sleep, and talking about areas where veterans and military are high risk and what we can do about preventing suicide. So why do we need to address the underlying causes of suicide? Right now, suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death for all ages in the U.S., and in the age range of 10 to 34, it is the second leading cause of death, and from ages 35 to 54 it is the fourth leading cause of death in those age groups. In 2017, according to the CDC, the death rate was about 14 people for 100,000, and then the DODSR, or the DoD Suicide Event Report, showed that for active veterans or active duty, that the rate was 20.2 per 100,000. So even just looking at active duty versus civilian population, it is a higher rate, and veterans are considered an at-risk population for suicide due to these higher rates. And so we have to look then at some of the populations within the military or veterans in general, so we can understand why the rates are higher and what can be done about it. All right. And this is addressing why we need to do resiliency training. Right. So every branch of the military does have gatekeeper training, and it is an important aspect of preventing suicide. Gatekeeper training is training designed to recognize those that are suicidal and get them the right help at the right time. So for the Army, it is ACE. They get their ACE cards. For the Navy, it is the SAIL program. The Marines have a program. There are plenty of organizations that go and help and try and help recognize issues. The problem is that the rate of suicides in both the veteran and civilian population has continued to rise, according to the CDC. So I'd like you to, if you're by yourself, think about why suicide rates are going up. Do you have any specific thoughts? A lot of people think it has something to do with social media, isolation, a lot of different reasons why the rate is going up. Right, so let's talk about recognizing the risks that a lot of the gatekeeper training uses now. And it's to kind of help familiarize with the process, and we'll go over each one here. All right, and in this section we've got the people who talk about killing themselves, feeling hopeless, having no reason to live, being a burden to others, feeling trapped, feeling like they're in unbearable pain. Behaviors, this could be the increased use of alcohol or drugs, maybe looking for a way to end their lives, such as searching online, withdrawing from activities, isolating themselves from family and friends, either sleeping too much or too little, visiting or calling people to say goodbye, giving away prized possessions, aggression, fatigue. And then when you look on the mood side of things, they could have depression, anxiety, loss of interest in the things they used to love or like to do, irritability, maybe they're showing signs of humiliation or shame, agitation, anger, maybe relief. In some cases, or sudden improvement could be that they've decided to end things in some cases. When we look at the health of a person, they could have depression, they could have substance use problems, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, any kind of personality traits that show aggression, mood changes or poor relationships, conduct disorders, anxiety disorders, serious physical health conditions including pain or even traumatic brain injury can be a risk factor for suicide. Within the environments, Access to lethal means, including firearms and drugs, is definitely high on the list, and it is something we do address later in the program. It could be prolonged stress, such as harassment, bullying, relationship problems, or unemployment. Stressful life events could be rejection, divorce, a financial crisis, or other life transitions or loss. It could be an exposure to another person's suicide. They have what they've termed suicide circles, where a person within a group can commit suicide, or a well-known person, and it can cause spikes in the rates of suicide. Maybe they've been exposed to graphic or sensationalized accounts of suicide. Right. From a historical perspective, if they have previously attempted suicide before, they are at much higher risk, and it could be they have a family history of things like suicide, maybe childhood abuse, neglect, or trauma. So there are a lot of reasons why someone could want to commit suicide. Even having all those, gatekeeper training identifies those risks, right? But gatekeeper training by itself is not enough. When we look at some of the numbers, and this one specifically, overall, out of 3,507 people that committed suicide, only 36% had no previous diagnosis of mental illness. All right. What does this mean? All right. In context, over 1/3 of those in the military did not activate gatekeeper training like ACE, the Ask Care Escort for the U.S. Army, for the U.S. Air Force, the Sailor Assistance and Intercept for Life, SAIL for the Navy. When they look at veterans overall, 14 of 20 veterans that committed suicide were not receiving services from the VA. So there are a lot of people not essentially in the loop, in a place where they could be recognized as part of this gatekeeper training. So we need to go after more than just the recognition. We need to talk about the things that lead to suicide and what can be done to help them. All right, so we've recognized that veterans are an at-risk population. In 2016, the unadjusted suicide rate among veterans was 30.1 per 100,000 people, while the rate among non-veteran adults was 16.4 per 100,000. And this is from the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. That's almost double the rate. All right. Suicide rate for veterans ages 18 to 34 increased substantially, from 40.4 suicide deaths per 100,000 population in 2015 to 45 suicide deaths per 100,000 in 2016. And in some cases, there are even higher rates. When they adjusted for age in 2016, the suicide rate for women veterans was 1.8 times greater than the suicide rate for non-veteran women. So why are veterans at greater risk than the civilian population? There are many reasons why and where veterans may be vulnerable. The first is poverty. Now, there have been multiple studies linking poverty to suicide. One study showed that linked 75% of the worldwide suicides to low and middle income countries. Now, veterans do have a lower rate of poverty than the average American, but when you factor in the number of veterans, the 1.5 million veterans in the U.S., it's still a large number of veterans who are living in poverty. Now, poverty statistics for the military, they're difficult to track, and in many cases they're lacking statistics in specific areas. But there have been some studies showing or reporting done that 1/4 of students enrolled in Department of Defense schools were eligible for free meals. In addition, the 2013 census showed 23,000 active duty military were receiving food assistance or food stamps, what they call SNAP. And nearly 1 million homes of veterans received funds for supplemental food. So poverty is a risk, and there are things we can do to help people that are low income. All right, other reasons why veterans are at risk. All right, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, or transgender community is known to be more affected than the general population when it comes to suicide. The military is estimated to have 6.1% on active status, and there are over 1 million LGBTQ veterans. This is a higher rate than the normal population estimate of 4.1%. Finding studies specifically targeting the LGBTQ population in the military are tough, but studies that looked at high school age showed they were 4.5 times as likely as other students to attempt suicide, and over 40% considered suicide. And there are many factors that lead to this higher rate, such as being a stigmatized minority, isolation, history of depression, anxiety, bullying, and these are all thought to increase the risk of suicide, and they can be carried into the military service. All right, another area, overwhelming stress. Now, stress is not in and of itself bad, but high levels of stress can lead to maladaptive behaviors. These would be things that lead to poor choices. Right. The ability to deal with overwhelming stress is impacted by the military-related stressors such as combat exposure, relationship issues, pain and illness, changes in work environment, loneliness, and other work-related stress. Research has shown that women in the military consistently reported higher levels of stress leading to depressive symptoms, and men exhibit more related substance abuse issues, and these are both linked to higher levels of suicidal behaviors and suicidal ideation. So this type of stress overload can lead to for example, these evaluated reservists met the requirement for mental health treatment at a rate of 42% and active duty at 20% when returning from deployment. So stress is a major factor leading to depression, and there are high links to depression and suicide. Other risks, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Right. So one study showed that up to 20% of combat veterans or combat troops were being impacted by PTSD. This is much higher than the civilian rate. Most civilians will have about a 3.6% chance of experiencing PTSD per year, and over a lifetime, the prevalence of PTSD in civilians is about 6.8%. So anyone who's deployed is almost 3 times as likely to experience PTSD. Now, just because someone is not deployed does not mean they can't experience PTSD. This can neglect the fact that sexual assault survivors or those living under harsh events or seeing graphic elements, and maybe those working in policing and medical care could experience PTSD. All right. And PTSD is known to increase the risk of suicide due to this emotional trauma. Other risks, as mentioned before, depression is highly linked to suicide. In fact, it is the single most common mental health disorder, and it affects about an estimated 15.7 million U.S. citizens over the age of 18, which is about 7% of all U.S. adults. One VA study showed that showed in 2008, 1 in 3 veterans exhibited some signs of depression during primary care visits, and 1 in 5 showed serious signs of depression. What's the significance here? Some of it is that data from Health and Human Services show that 2% of those treated for depression in an outpatient setting will commit suicide, and those that have been treated in an inpatient setting, or those that have been hospitalized, will be twice as likely to commit suicide, about 4%. All right, other potential issues: isolation or lack of social connection. Isolation is loneliness. Lack of social connection has been relatively overlooked when looking at factors related to suicide. However, new studies are examining the concept of social connection due to recent spikes in suicides in more affluent nations. And in fact, worldwide, the suicide rate was down for 2018. However, they're seeing, and they actually are saying that's because the economies are improving in some of the other countries. However, in countries like the US that have higher income, they're still showing a rise in suicide rates, and they're trying to find out why that is. So loneliness has been linked to suicidal behavior, even when factoring for other mental health conditions. Veterans as a subgroup of the population are very susceptible to loneliness, especially older veterans. All right. Other common issues are sleep disorders. All right. According to the American Sleep Association, 70% of Americans have insufficient sleep one night per week, and 11% have insufficient sleep every night. Veterans were noted to have more issues with insufficient sleep than the civilian population, and this is one of the reasons why it can be a significant risk factor. Sleep disturbances are the single most common complaint for military returning from contingency operations. Specifically, those suffering from hypersomnia, which is sleeping too much, or insomnia, having difficulty going and staying to sleep, they have increased levels of suicidal behaviors or ideations. Another issue or potential risk is traumatic brain injury. TBI would be considered the signature injury of OEF and OIF, according to many researchers. Over 24,000 veterans were reported to have TBIs between 2008 and 2011. Those that suffered from one TBI were 1.5 times as likely to commit suicide. Those with multiple TBIs had twice the incidence of suicidal ideations and behaviors. Other risks include alcohol or other substance abuse. So alcohol and substance abuse are listed as risk factors for suicide, while illicit drug use in the military is lower, even when looking at abuse of prescription drugs. However, military young adults have a higher chance to engage in heavy drinking than civilians of similar ages in both males and females. 32% of military males aged 18 to 25 engage in heavy drinking, while 18% of civilian males of a similar age were likely to drink heavily. So that's a big jump going from civilian to military there. Those returning from OIF, OEF, or deployments were consuming problematic amounts of alcohol at a rate of 12 to 15% within 3 to 6 months following post-deployment from combat zones. And then studies of veterans found roughly 30% of suicides were in conjunction with alcohol or drug abuse. So there is definitely a link to alcohol and substance abuse, and there are higher instances of that for the military and veterans. All right, another risk is stigma. This is an unfortunately common problem because when you look at the gatekeeper training, if you look at services that are available through the VA and other military medical access, services are available, but according to a study from a gentleman, Mr. Held, in 2013, even though they were available, many service members or veterans simply did not use them. Until 2016, suicide attempts were still considered criminal activity under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Many medications require a 3-month stabilization period before allowing deployment, so that may stop many from seeking care they need. Additionally, those that seek mental health treatment while deployed may be deemed not fit for duty as a precautionary measure, leading to serious stigmatization and feelings of guilt. And these were all from a DoD report in 2013. Finally, the American Institute of Stress notes that less than 20% of those that completed suicides in the military sought help through chain of command, behavioral health services, or chaplains. So people are simply not reaching out for the help that they need. All right, now there's not really much that can be done in this case, but ethnicity in some cases can be a significant risk factor. White Americans, when comparing rates among ethnic groups, are only second to Native American populations, and Native American populations have the highest suicide rate in the U.S. The military is approximately 60% white Americans, and they are an at-risk group. Blacks and Latinos of military age are statistically much less likely to commit suicide or make a suicide attempt. 85% of the military is male, and 75% is under the age of 30. In fact, 91% of the active component are under age 40, and when you look at the statistics set from the very beginning, that 18 to 40 range is a high-risk group for suicide. Okay, so what can be done? All right, gatekeeper training alone is not going to suffice to capture everyone at risk for suicide. There definitely needs to be a focus on evidence-based practices, and practical resources may be the answer. And in some cases could be simply identifying the problem, allocating the resources that are available, and hopefully helping people. All right, so I'd like you to think about, if you're by yourself, how many people have you helped find valuable resources during times of crisis? What were some common problems or problem areas that veterans or military needed to navigate? And were you able to help them or get them the help they needed? Essentially, was there ever a problem you ran into that there was no solution to? All right. And again, we want to use evidence-based practices, and these are practices that apply the principles and techniques of evidence-based decision-making to interventions designed to reduce suicide risk and behaviors. These evidence-based practices offer proven ways to promote health and prevent disease among adults. Development and promotion of evidence-based practices are expected to provide a rational, empirical basis for decisions about treatment policies and practices, increase treatment effectiveness by improving client outcomes, facilitate consistency in practice, assist in developing accountability systems, and increase the cost effectiveness of treatment and improve the quality of treatment. All right, so there are a lot of ways to apply these evidence-based practices, and it could start with gatekeeper training, looking at the efficacy or how effective gatekeeper training in the services already is. All right, now the CDC has already put a lot of energy into creating evidence-based practices, and they continue to focus on those that study and attempt to help with suicide prevention. And they have some core tenets that are accompanying classes that will go with each of these areas. All right, the first is to strengthen economic support. The next is to strengthen access and delivery of suicide care. Then create protective environments. Next, we're going to promote connectedness, and then teach coping and problem-solving skills. Identify and support people at risk, and then lessen harms and prevent future risk. And as you can see, there are areas that things are in place already, right? Identify and support people at risk. That's the gatekeeper training. Lessening harms. We've got our risk assessments. There are veterans programs and military programs that help people that have been identified. There are economic support channels for the military. So there are things that can be done, and in some cases it could simply be pointing the person in the right direction. All right, other protective factors that the CDC has recognized: access to care and intervention are crucial aspects of suicide prevention. Family and community support or connectedness are protective factors. Problem solving, conflict resolution and non-violent dispute management can improve the risk of suicides, and then spiritual beliefs that discourage suicide. So the CDC has already recognized that novel approaches beyond just the treatment and identification of mental health disorders must be engaged to reduce suicides. All right, so there will be a course list being produced that will be made available, and here are the list of courses that you can have access to. The first will cover mental resiliency training, so we can tie into the social connection and conflict resolution aspect. The next will be physical activity. There are ties to physical activity and suicidal ideation. Stress management, and as you can see earlier in this slide assembly, that stress plays a large part in in suicide prevention. Eating healthy has a lot to do with the sleep hygiene, meaning and purpose, self-esteem, and then looking at available resources to assist veterans. So these are ways that we can potentially help people prevent suicide. Now, there have been studies that specifically targeted military and veterans, and they found that certain mental profiles were resistant to overwhelming stress, leading to suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviors. Some of the key attributes they found were hardiness, or the ability to adapt, purpose, overarching sense of what one wants to do, leadership, having a sense of control, effort, and this is a sense that someone's doing the best that they can, and then spiritual. Now, this is not necessarily related to religion. It can mean a lot of things for a lot of different people. Other areas they noticed were the exterior forces that increased resistance to suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviors in military and veterans. Now, while they were in the combat zone, it was the unit member support and leader support that helped provide these protective factors. And the military support after redeployment was community support, and then another category they called instrumental support, and this was based on family appreciation and then strong family and friends networks. And you can see there's a lot of things here with connections or social connection. All right, so in closing, resiliency programs can assist those that do not activate gatekeeper training. Normalization of mental health programs and health-seeking activities can reduce the stigma associated with mental health services. Some veterans already exist, some services already exist, but veterans may need education on how to utilize them. And then finally, building connection, building communication and resources can help all veterans, whether they are suicidal or not. So there is something that everyone hopefully can get from these programs. All right, if you're seeing all this, then quite a bit of research into this subject. Hopefully you've gotten something from this course. I appreciate your time. Again, my name was Malcolm Carlyle. Have a good day.